I was by myself at Realistic then for a while. Right before the Rome show, Greg Irons had divorced himself from the street tattoo shop scene and wasn't sure he wanted to work out of his apartment, was looking for a situation, and I had finally made the decision, kind of in returning to my Japanese roots. I realized that I wanted to spend more time communicating with Japan, and so I decided to cut the shop loose in East LA, which had still been going on with very minimal involvement on my part. So I sold that place, sold the property, and bought a second studio here in San Francisco. Fran convinced me that we should have something that was more secure, that wasn't just a rented space the way Realistic was in case anything should ever happen. So I got into kind of back myself further away from the street into this present studio where I work now, and which is really appointment only, and I was going to close Realistic down. I didn't know what to do with it. Leo didn't want to take it over. He was kind of the heir apparent, and he was doing other things. I think he was in fact working in Europe at the time. And then Irons occurred to me. I called Irons. I said, "What do you want to run Realistic?" And he went, "Yeah, great, perfect. It's just the right setup." This guy had this, brilliant artistry. He had proved himself, had made a very big name for himself very rapidly in tattooing. He had quite a name as an underground cartoonist. He was one of the great lights in the tattoo scene in the early '80s there, had brought about a major shift in style, had published a lot of sets of Flash that influenced tattoo imagery all over the world, and brought kind of a fresh graphic look to it. Could deal with people, was a nice guy, we had a good sense of humor together. That was going to happen, and to not stick him with that shop by himself, Bill Salmon, who was a very close friend and had been tattooing for a couple of years at that point, also was out of the situation. And I always felt that Bill would be just, had as great a potential as anybody I've ever met in tattooing. As a brilliant take on life, and his perception and the quickness of his mind and his capacity for invention is phenomenal. So he had just kind of started his tattoo career, but I thought, well, this is a great chance. He can work with Greg, and he can learn a lot from Greg, and he can help shore up the shop and take on a lot of the extra work. So it was going to be Bill and Greg. They got into running Realistic. The three of us did it there a little while, and then Greg took off on a big trip. He wanted to get out of his system down to, he'd never been to Asia, traveled and lived in Europe a lot, went to Japan, Hong Kong, went to Southeast Asia, and unfortunately got hit by a bus in Bangkok and died, and that was in, I think, November of '84. So that kind of left me dangling here and left Bill with sole charge of Realistic. I was involved in this new shop, and I didn't know how Bill would do with it. Neither here I knew. It was pretty frightening for everybody, and of course we were all tremendously depressed at Greg's untimely departure. And
the special thing about Jennifer is that she had this whole feeling for the Art Deco. Was her suggestion and idea to kind of go with that theme. Even with a little variation on the theme, it does create a whole feeling rather than, run the image gambit there with a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There's somewhat of a relationship to all these separate tattoos here on her, and as we do more work, it will all tie together and I think be one nice picture theme. The Deco theme, which is not to say it hasn't been done in tattooing, but it's not quite as pronounced as some of the other things that the people are concentrating on. And
I don't particularly want a lot of little things that don't tie together. I'd like to have kind of a main theme or maybe two main themes running through. And I like the idea of a lot of negative space, but I'd like the kind of overall view as being pretty much covered, but not being solid at the same time. We'll see if it works.
That says if I do a good job on this one, I get the job here. People always say that, they say, well, how long have you been doing this? I said, well...
Around, I guess in '85 as well, Dan Toé moved back to town. I had met him through Professor Arnold Rubin at UCLA. Arnold had been documenting tattooing and had put together a symposium on body marking and all that. Just before Jamie died, which I guess would have been 1983. I had met Dan at that time. Dan was a tattoo collector, and his focus was on Micronesia, the way mine has been on Japan. And he and his partner, Maria Yatar, who's Guamanian, had been down in the South Pacific in Micronesia collecting tattoo information. And then Dan had begun to tattoo by hand. And he'd come back from one of his forays of living out there in the islands. I'd visited him there, actually, in '83 as part of my return to Japan trip. I'd gone down and tattooed in Guam a bit, and then he and I had gone to Palau, and I tattooed some people there, and so he'd introduced me to that part of the world, reintroduced me. I'd been in Guam as a teenager. I lived there for a summer. Dan came back around San Francisco, and I said, well, you're going to do some tattooing in town, and he was, and he didn't know quite what he was going to do with it or how, and I suggested he join up with Bill at the studio, so that happened, and it worked out very well. And he developed, much the same way Jamie had developed her own look, he developed his own style of work, which was hand tattooing, non-electric, and a very different kind of imagery, and a totally unique treatment, and brought a whole new scope to the studio that hadn't been there before. So Dan and Bill were running that, and things were going along quite well. And Dan was making forays down to Micronesia. He had received, become part of a grant process that enabled him to further research in a real hardcore way the existing tattooing in Micronesia, with an eye to publishing it and doing a film eventually on that.
You get a nice spatial feeling and stretching and condensing of the body. I'm real excited about that piece on Susie. I came in January of '85, and when you see how hard these people are working, you can't help but work just harder yourself to become what you can be, not to copy or to become the same, but to make your own voice be known in the world, and share that, and they've definitely taken me along very fast.
Philip Liu came into the picture, who's a young Swiss tattooist who was doing some really brilliant work, very influenced by Greg Iron's style. I had met Philip and his sister in Japan, and I was impressed with the guy and with the level of work he was doing. And he said he was coming through San Francisco and kind of wanted to stay in California for a while, so I suggested that he might be able to fit in at Realistic. So he worked for a number of months at Realistic, and Philip's out learning about the world and gypsying around and gaining a lot of experience here and there. So he moved on after a while and is, I believe, back in Europe now. But he worked here for about, I think, 5 or 6 months, and it was a little crowded at the shop with 3 people. And then quite recently, Dan has moved off on his own. He's into kind of a new phase of his own work, and so the current manpower is me in this studio and Bill at Realistic, and for the time being, I guess that's how it will stay, although you never know what's going to happen.